So you're not just a founder, but you're also a mother of two. So how do you balance the demands of your family life with the pressure of running two businesses?
That's a great question, and it's not one that I think many of us can easily answer. I just don't allow any of the guilt to seep through because I feel that it's a great example to my daughter and to my son.
So from everything that you've learned, is there like a skill or a mindset that, or even like a motto that you think teenagers should start developing now if they either just even want to be an entrepreneur one day?
I think that's one area where I would have probably spent more time on earlier career is learning how to communicate better. I am what you would probably consider as, pretty strong individual and feel very, sure and confident of my views, and I can sort of fight my corner pretty well. But what I learned late is that it's also important to be likable and approachable and make sure you understand what the other side of the table gains.
I think often a lot of, especially teenage girls, but just teenagers in general, scared or nervous about failure. But then again, what does failure actually mean? Because from your case, it seems like an amazing lesson that helped thrive your other two businesses. And if you hadn't had that, maybe you'd gone into these other two businesses and they would have maybe not had the same impact or been able to survive in like COVID and the GFC and other really tough times. Hi, I'm Sia Kantaria, and welcome back to Female Founder Stories, Women at the Top Told by a Teen. You and I are going behind the scenes of entrepreneurship, hearing from incredible women about the grit, the setbacks, and the breakthroughs it takes to build something real, told in a way that makes you think, I could do that too. Today's guests grew up in the Middle East, where women weren't always encouraged to go into business. But Ghada Sousou built not one, but two companies in London. Sousou Partners, an executive search firm finding leaders for top businesses, and Sousou Connect, an advisory firm that links investors with opportunities. Along the way, she's navigated tough financial markets and the challenges of raising a family while running two businesses. Ghada, welcome to Female Founder Stories.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here, Sia.
So can you take us back to the beginning and what made you want to first step into the world of business, especially given that you were surrounded in an environment that wasn't encouraging you to go into the business world?
Absolutely. As you say, I grew up actually really sort of with one path ahead of me. The idea was that I grew up in the Middle East. I went to the US to study. I was lucky enough to also do my undergrad and my MBA in the US. But the idea was always, we were brought up with the idea of education. And then you get back home and, the path generally for women at the time was you come back home and potentially get married and have a family. And if you were to work, it was a side thing. This was very much entrenched in our culture and in our circles. Once I had graduated from my MBA in the US, I think what first drove me is the simple decision that I wanted to stay a little longer in the US before I went back home. There were certain circumstances, exogenous circumstances that helped that decision, including, at the time there was the war in Kuwait. And because of that, it made more sense for me just logistically to be in the US. My mother, a stay-at-home mom, but she always also worked. She had businesses. They were on the side, but she was very entrepreneurial. So I did have that influence. Although it was in the back of my head, it was still very much there. So that's what first got me started in terms of thinking about business.
That's really interesting. I'm also just interested to know, maybe did the US kind of push you to think more about like business and almost like an entrepreneurial mindset? Because a lot of the US courses, I'm looking at the US for university, so like I'm seeing a lot of the courses just incorporate business because you have to take so many different classes into the curriculum. So did you find that?
Yeah, I don't know if it was something that was deliberate or not, but my MBA was at Babson, which is a school that's known for entrepreneurship, actually. So a lot of my courses were around entrepreneurship. I think I was always driven to think about business in that way. Again, maybe just, subconsciously from my mother's experience and just my own makeup. And I was always fascinated with, starting a business as opposed to sort of coming into business. That wasn't my very first stint. I actually did work for a firm, or another firm. But I think there was a seed, whether it was through school or just being surrounded with my mother's businesses that she had started successfully, actually, in the Middle East. But yes, I mean, the US obviously is a completely different culture. And it's, having done my MBA, I was surrounded with that influence, if you like, for sure.
So, for teens who might not actually fully understand what your two businesses are, can you first explain them in simple terms? And then also, can you tell us how you kind of saw the gap in the market or where you became really interested in starting these businesses?
Yes, absolutely. So Sousou Partners is what we would call an executive search firm, which means that it's headhunting. However, it's at the more senior end. And the big difference between headhunters and executive search is that we are what we call retained, which means that our clients retain us to go out and do an assignment. So we don't work on the back end, but we get retained. Our fees, 2/3 of our fees are paid upfront. So it's a very different sort of approach to business. And Sousou Partners only focuses on real estate. So that's what we do. We headhunt senior professionals for our clients to come in and either run businesses or run teams within the real estate asset class. So most of our clients are either private equity funds, so they're investment groups in private equity funds or sovereigns or family offices or large corporate. That's what Sousou Partners does. And I started that business in 2000, so 25 years ago. It's a very tight environment, as in, it was great that I was able to focus on such a tight niche part of the market because it meant that it was easier for me to build relationships and become an expert in something, albeit it was very, very narrow. But we became, we grew our reputation as having, as really being entrenched within the real estate world. And we started building relationships with real estate investors. And what was really interesting about that is that, once you do this for such a long time, you've got such deep relationships. It opens up a lot of avenues to think about, as you say, gaps in the market. And so that really led me to my second business, Sousou Connect. I started that business in 2015. So that was 15 years after I started Sousou Partners. And that business is really filling the gap within our ecosystem. So just within the groups of individuals and firms that we know, we introduce them to each other. And that's really mostly capital introductions. So it's introducing clients who have capital to clients who have deals. And we introduce them together. And we take a fee on that introduction, on the successful introduction. So they very much go hand in hand. There's a lot of what we call cross-selling. We love the fact that we are able to go to the same client and have very in-depth conversations, not only about people, but about capital, about deals. So it broadens the topics that we're able to engage with our client. And it's a lovely circle because that just, again, allows us to get even closer and even deeper with our clients and our what we call candidate.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Also, it really shows the power of networking and connections, just even in terms of not just business, but also how your two businesses link together as well. And it kind of seems like one almost fueled the other to begin.
That's exactly right. Did exactly that. And you're spot on, Sia, because, it is all about relationship. And I'll add one more thing, which is what really drives me, I think, every morning. There's a lot of professional, but also personal growth in those businesses for me as an entrepreneur. And I think that's what keeps me very excited.
So you're not just a founder, but you're also a mother of two. So how do you balance the demands of your family life with the pressure of running two businesses?
That's a great question. And it's not one that I think many of us can easily answer. I feel the short answer for me is I pretty much every morning wake up and decide what the balance is for that day. So, and it's not easy because you're always constantly thinking about where you need to be. And I say need to be because that's where it starts. But I think, again, it's the sort of thing that feeds each other. So I think I'm a more interesting and probably a better mother for it. And so, I just don't allow any of the guilt to seep through because I feel that it's a great example to my daughter and to my son in terms of, my focus and where I spend my energy. So they're watching it firsthand. I was lucky. I do work for myself. I've got two businesses, we employ altogether around 25 people. It's a demanding schedule. I'm in the office a lot. I'm with clients a lot. But at the end of the day, I don't report into anyone. And I think that that's helped me a lot in terms of making my own decisions in terms of how I manage that. But for any entrepreneur, it's never, obviously it's not a 9-to-5 job. So it's constant, which means that you're constantly battling or thinking about balance.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that has been voiced by many of the founders that I've spoken to, not just about trying to get that right balance, like the pros and cons of entrepreneurship. I mean, you're not like tied down to a 9 to 5 job. And as you said, you're working for yourself, so you don't have to report back into anyone. However, at the same time, that work is always ongoing and there's no kind of switch off time.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It suits me though, because I think my makeup is such that I feel empowered by it and I'm very excited. I think that I get very excited about, all aspects of my life. I feel like my life is full, and I would recommend this any day to anyone who's interested in setting up a business. I do get asked a lot of times about, isn't it an easier path to go into an institution and just sort of follow your path through and, you can switch off, and it could be or not. I think what the decision needs to be about what drives you. I think that's the most important part.
I couldn't agree more. I always like have this kind of motto of why would I do something that's easier when I know that I can push myself to make myself like better.
I think that's lovely. I'll use that here.
And so now coming back to like our teenage audience. So from everything that you've learned, is there like a skill or a mindset that, or even like a motto that you think teenagers should start developing now if they either just even want to be an entrepreneur one day or even not?
That's a good question. I think, yes, I think resilience and grit, because I've never come across an entrepreneur who hasn't gone through cycles. And there will be days where it just feels like when you're in the throes of, difficult scenarios, whether it's markets or situations or what have you, where it's difficult to work through. And sometimes part of you wants to throw in the towel. And I think it's a muscle. And I think discipline, grit, and resilience is incredibly important. I think it's the universal quality for any successful entrepreneur. And it's not something that you wake up with. I think there is, you have to practice it, because as teenagers, I think you need to have, as you're going through your own schoolwork and your own sort of schedule, discipline and hard work and grit is always going to be important. I think that carries right through your career. So I'd say that's the number one thing. The other thing, I think for some of us, communication comes easy. So we're just either, naturally good at it. But I think all of us can improve that as well. I think that's one area where I would have probably spent more time on earlier in my career, is learning how to communicate better. There are big lessons that I had to learn the hard way. For example, in my case, I am what you would probably consider as, pretty strong individual and feel very, sure and confident of my views, and I can sort of fight my corner pretty well. But what I learned late is that it's also important to be likable and approachable and make sure you understand what the other side of the table gains. So your starting point is important. I try and teach this to my kids all the time. So it's not always what you say, it's also how you say it. So these lessons I'm just thinking about what I would have done differently. I think I would have liked to have learned that a little earlier on. As women, again, potentially it's maybe because of my starting point I was fighting against, which is what we talked about earlier in our discussion, which is as a woman, do you really go out and build your own business? At least in my culture, do you really focus on that as a primary goal in your life, or is it more family? So I always felt like I had to fight my corner very, very, very hard, which probably didn't teach me very good lessons about how to sort of deliver the message or get what I want in a way that made sense to everyone around me. So it's not only what you say, but how you say it. I'd say these are the two main things.
I think that's really good advice, and also all of the things that you said, other than maybe resilience and hard work, it's not really something taught in schools. Really, it's just a quality that you acquire and you learn, and like from your mistakes, like you have said, or from other people telling you. So thank you for sharing that. And one more thing. So you just said that you like sometimes you feel like you want to throw the towel in and like you've had enough. And can you share a moment where you've almost been in that situation or where you felt really uncertain and pushed through it?
Unfortunately, several of those examples, I've been through a couple of I'd say two very difficult cycles. One was the GFC and the other was COVID, business-wise. So there was one particular time, which is where I was probably closest to having had enough, as you put it. And it wasn't something that was in my control. I think that's what was so difficult. So we had just come off a very, very strong cycle. So our business was operating within our industry. Our industry was doing incredibly well. And the GFC happened, that's global financial crisis, and in 2007 and 8. And our clients struggled a lot. And so what happened was that business went from boom to bust. It's a very difficult thing to deal with as a small business. very, very difficult thing to deal with, because obviously you've got your costs and you've got the revenues that you've been relying on to cover your costs. So when the world is kind of pulled from underneath you, it's difficult, especially back then. It was probably my first experience at a tough market. We were very, very blessed to have still had a strong client base. So we didn't go out of business. A lot of our competitors actually went out of business at the time. So we were holding on, but with the grit of our teeth, I have to say. And our main client at the time, so most of our clients had to pull out. Our main client was a large sovereign fund in the Middle East. And as a business, you've got your payment cycles. And usually, if you're doing well, you're not really as focused on when your clients pay, because you've got enough of a cushion. But as I said, at that time, it was difficult because revenues went down, costs were still ongoing. And our main client was always late in terms of their payment. So I had to communicate to them the importance of getting our payment at the right time so that we can continue surviving. It was a survival. It was existential for my business at the time. When you're dealing with a sovereign that doesn't understand small businesses, that was a very difficult time. I had to fly in. I had to meet with our main client. I had to explain. I had to, and the reaction was, of course, no worries. Of course, we'll deal with it. No problem whatsoever. It'll be fine. But it wasn't fine because I don't think, when you don't know what it means to have to survive, it's difficult to understand it. So they were always late. And yeah, I mean, that at that point, it was existential. We became very creative. We spoke to banks. I learned a lot. I learned an incredible amount. I didn't know about sort of loans and how to convince banks to take a punt on us and how to raise capital. That wasn't sort of what I was doing day in, day out. But I learned quickly and we managed through it. And it was the best thing I ever did. But that was one of the examples. Tough time.
I think often once you come out of a really difficult situation, you often look back and it definitely seems like from your case, you look back and think that really taught me a lot. Like all the situations that you have, it's like either a lesson or like it was meant to happen, is something that I really believe in.
100%. And with that, I do want to say that before I set up those two businesses, I had set up another business that did fail. And so I think we should never be worried about failure. It taught me everything, and that gave me a lot of drive and resilience, and laser focused me on lessons learned that actually probably drove a lot of the success that I've had since.
Well, I think often a lot of, especially teenage girls, but just teenagers in general, scared or nervous about failure. But then again, what does failure actually mean? Because from your case, it seems like an amazing lesson that helped thrive your other two businesses. And if you hadn't had that, maybe you'd gone into these other two businesses and they would have maybe not had the same impact or been able to survive in like COVID and the GFC and other really tough times.
I think that's exactly right. That's exactly right. It's really important to always learn lessons and feel like, they're all opportunities for learning and growing.
My final question, it's actually the opposite of failure. So you've built businesses, you've raised a family, and you've broken through like social barriers, but what does success mean to you now?
These are great questions, yeah. So I'm at a stage at the moment where I am thinking about the options ahead of me. So I'm 55 years old. My kids are, I've got my daughter who's at university and my son who's entering senior school. And I'm at a stage where I'm thinking about my next stage in terms of my career and my life. So success at the moment, I think it changes. I think it changes. I mean, if you asked me this 5 years ago, it's probably that I would grow the business to a certain scale that I never have a question about viability. So that I was lucky enough to achieve. So at the moment, success for me is about the next stage of my life and how I think about potentially monetizing some of the hard work and scaling the business. And that's what I'm very focused on at the moment. The broader question of success is happiness for me. It's about, making sure that I'm happy. That's the broader answer. But I think you kind of have to break it down. And I think it's always about being happy and being satisfied and joy. But that's very elusive. I think that, if you ask yourself every morning, is this a happy day? Some days are going to be tough days. As long as you've got that broader drive, I think that answer changes. It chops and changes for me. So at the moment, it's about, when I say monetizing, we're looking at strategic partnerships. We are discussing our options in terms of how to grow the business. The industry is changing tremendously. There's a lot of firms that are being that are merging, ventures. And so it's very exciting. Being an entrepreneur is very exciting. It never stops. It's not only about your day job. It's not about me just calling my clients and trying to solve their problem. It's also about thinking about the business at large. So I think, I think that's where I am in terms of trying to define success for the next phase.
So, Ghada, thank you so much for giving up your time. For anyone listening, we've learned so much today, not only about the highs and lows of entrepreneurship, but about the resilience that you need, the grit that you need. And also, Ghada has shown us how, communication is really important, but also how inspiring she is. She's broken through social barriers. She's raised a family, which I know from my mum, that's another full-time job, having to pick up your kids from school and all those things. So it's absolutely incredible. And I hope you've taken away a lot from it. So see you next time. Just a quick note, this podcast has been produced with 7 Million Bikes podcast. And if you're thinking about starting your own podcast or want a podcast episode edited, get in touch with Neil Mackay. He's been a great help to me. Thank you.